The village of Ikeja was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, where the sound of grinding stones and evening prayers filled the air, and where stories were passed down like precious heirlooms. But of all the stories whispered around cooking fires and under moonlit skies, none was more feared than the legend of the Whispering Well. Amina sat on the edge of her mother's bed, watching the woman's chest rise and fall in shallow, labored breaths. The fever had come suddenly, 3 days ago, turning her mother's skin hot to the touch and her eyes glassy with pain. The herbalist had visited that morning, leaving behind a small pouch of crushed leaves and roots with strict instructions. Mix with fresh water from the well, boil until the steam turns sweet, and give it to her before dawn. Fresh water. The words echoed in Amina's mind as she glanced toward the window. The sun had set hours ago, and the darkness outside was absolute, thick and impenetrable. Their clay water pot sat empty in the corner, its hollow sound mocking her when she had tapped it earlier. "Amina," her mother whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't go. Wait until morning." But morning might be too late. Amina had seen the way her mother's fingers trembled, had heard the rattle in her breathing that grew worse with each passing hour. Her father was away in the city trying to find work to feed them through the dry season. Her younger brothers were asleep in the other room, their small bodies curled together for warmth. There was no one else, only her. "I'll be quick, Mama," Amina said, forcing confidence into her voice that she didn't feel. "The well isn't far." She stood and moved toward the door, but a bony hand shot out and gripped her wrist with surprising strength. Her grandmother emerged from the shadows of the room, her ancient face carved with deep lines of worry. "Child, you know the stories," her grandmother said, her voice low and urgent. "The Whispering Well does not sleep. After dark, it calls to those who come near. It knows your name. It knows your fears. And once it calls you, once you hear your name in that water, you must never, ever answer." Amina had heard the stories all her life. How the well had been dug 200 years ago by the village founders. How it had always provided sweet, clean water. How it had saved them through countless droughts. But how over time, people who went there after sunset began to report strange things. Voices, whispers, the sound of their own names being called from the depth of the earth. Some said it was the spirits of those who had died of thirst, forever seeking water. Others claimed it was something older, something that existed before the village, before the forest, before memory itself, a thing that fed on fear and loneliness. But Amina was 16 years old, and she had stopped believing in ghost stories when she was 12. Or at least that's what she told herself. "Grandmother, those are just tales to scare children," she said gently, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I don't believe in spirits." Her grip tightened. "Belief has nothing to do with it. The well doesn't care what you think. It only cares that you came." Amina pulled her hand free, trying to ignore the cold dread settling in her stomach. She picked up the metal bucket from beside the door, its handle worn smooth from years of use, and took down the kerosene lantern from its hook. The flame inside flickered as she lit it, casting dancing shadows across the walls. "I'll be back before you know it," she said, and stepped out into the night before anyone could stop her. The darkness swallowed her immediately. The lantern's small circle of light seemed pathetically inadequate against the vast emptiness surrounding the village. Amina could hear the familiar sounds of nighttime, the distant barking of dogs, the rustle of chickens settling in their coops, the murmur of voices from houses where families gathered for evening meals. But as she walked toward the edge of the village, toward the narrow path that led into the forest where the well waited, those sounds began to fade. The dirt road beneath her feet was packed hard from decades of footsteps, visible in the lantern light as a pale ribbon stretching ahead. She had walked this path 1,000 times in daylight, racing her brothers to see who could fetch water fastest, stopping to pick flowers or watch birds building their nests. In daylight, the forest was beautiful, full of life and color and possibility. But at night, it was different. At night, the trees became giants looming overhead, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers toward the stars. The usual symphony of crickets and night birds was absent, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure against her ears. Amina walked faster, her sandals slapping against the ground in a rhythm that sounded too loud, too frantic. The lantern swung in her hand, making the shadows junk and dance in unsettling ways. She tried to think of her mother, of how relieved she would be to return with water, and how quickly they could prepare the medicine. That's when she heard it. Soft at first, so faint she thought she'd imagined it. A sound like wind moving through leaves, except there was no wind. A sound like distant conversation, except there was no one there. A sound like her name. Amina. She stopped walking, her breath caught in her throat. The bucket handle dug into her palm as her grip tightened. Just the wind, she told herself. Just your imagination. But the forest was completely still. Amina forced herself to keep moving, her legs feeling heavy as if she were walking through deep water. The path narrowed as she entered the forest proper, the trees pressing closer on either side. Their roots broke through the earth like the bones of buried giants, and she had to watch her step carefully to avoid tripping. The lantern's flame guttered suddenly, dimming to almost nothing before flaring back to life. Amina's heart lurched. She checked the kerosene reservoir. It was nearly full. There was no reason for the flame to behave that way. No reason except the one she didn't want to consider. The old shrine came into view on her left, a small structure made of stacked stones with a wooden roof that had long since begun to rot. In the daylight, villagers would stop here to leave offerings, small tokens of respect for the ancestors who watched over the well. Flowers, coins, sometimes food. But now, in the darkness, the shrine looked abandoned. The candles that usually burned there were cold and dark, their wax melted into grotesque shapes. Dead flowers littered the ground, their petals brown and withered. Something about the sight made my skin crawl. I hurried past it, walking faster now, almost running. The well was close, just around the next bend in the path. I could hear water, the faint sound of it moving, which was strange because the well was deep and still. I had never heard water sounds from it before. Then I was there. The clearing opened before me, a circular space where the trees fell back as if they feared to come too close. In the center stood the well, a structure of ancient stone blocks held together with clay and time. Its wooden covering had been removed years ago after a child nearly fell in, replaced with nothing but a low wall to mark its edge. I approached slowly, holding the lantern high. The well's opening yawned before me, a perfect circle of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I could smell the water far below, clean and cold, and somehow wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I set the lantern on the ground, tied the bucket to the rope that hung from the well's pulley system. The rope was thick and rough, marked with dark stains that might have been water or might have been something else. I began to lower the bucket, hand over hand, listening to it descend. The rope went down and down, much farther than I remembered. The well had always been deep, but this felt endless. I kept feeding rope through my hands until my arms ached, until I began to wonder if the bucket would ever reach water. Then I heard the splash, distant and echoing, but unmistakable.